In 1923, 1 century ago, Mary Beecher Longyear created the institution that would become Longyear Museum. At that time, the field of historic preservation virtually did not exist. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association had been preserving George Washington's Potomac River home and opening it to the public since 1853. But in 1923, that was about it. Colonial Williamsburg would not open until nearly 10 years later. The National Archive would not be established until 1934, the same year that Old Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts would open. Not until after World War II would the National Trust for Historic Preservation be established. So, in 1923 and before, Mary Longyear was pioneering in historic preservation as she collected reminiscences, letters, photos, and historic houses in which Mary Baker Eddy had once lived. This is the story of that pioneering work and its purpose: to advance the understanding and keep alive the memory of the life of the discoverer, founder, and leader of Christian Science.
By 1917, just 50 years after Mrs. Eddy had done her historic work here, the Wentworths' former house in Stoughton, much altered, stood on a busy and growing road among properties headed one day for demolition and development. Many historical remains of those early days of Christian Science were in danger of disappearing as if they meant nothing. Old records were being disposed of, recollections were fading, landmarks were falling into neglect or being sold off. The places of the trials and triumphs of Mrs. Eddy and her students were close to vanishing. At her birthplace in Bow, New Hampshire, all that remained of the Baker home were some foundation stones. By that point, officials of the Church of Christ Scientist and a number of private individuals had recognized the need and were collecting historical memorabilia. One person in particular, a woman of vision and energy, mounted a rescue mission. In the space of less than 20 years, she salvaged landmark houses, solicited memoirs of early workers and commissioned their portraits, and collected documents and artifacts. She was Mary Beecher Longyear. The fact that we can read many of those records and walk in so many of the places where Mrs. Eddy walked is due to Mary Longyear's goals and ideals, which to this day guide the Longyear Museum.
In 1877, 26-year-old Mary Beecher moved to Marquette, Michigan to take a job as a teacher. In her church, a tall, energetic young man caught her attention, John Monroe Longyear. She lost no time getting introduced. That was her way. Do it now. She and John were married 2 years later in Battle Creek. She called him Mun, after his middle name, Monroe. She was simply his Molly. Mun and Molly were a devoted couple.
Their marriage was a great success, as was everything else about them. During the 1880s, John's fortunes grew. Their prosperous lifestyle grew. Their family grew. They were wealthy, comfortable, looking toward a golden future when tragedy struck. Their third child, John Beecher Longyear, took sick. Within days, despite the best care money could buy, the child died. Mary was devastated. She went into deep, inconsolable mourning. At this point, a friend introduced the grief-stricken mother to Christian Science. In time, Mary was healed of the grief and despair. Over the next few years, she became a devoted Christian Scientist.
The Longyear family continued to grow. John Longyear's fortune continued to expand. Their Michigan home became a mansion. But big changes were coming. In 1902, the Longyears moved from Michigan to Boston for their children's education. At Brookline, a suburb of Boston, Mary and John rebuilt their mansion. The Longyears became members and active supporters of the Mother Church. Mary Longyear was invited to visit Mrs. Eddy, and over the years they corresponded numerous times on a number of topics, Mary receiving some 50 letters from Mrs. Eddy. In 1908, Mrs. Eddy moved from Concord, New Hampshire, back to the Boston area. Her home, just west of the city, was not far from the Longyears' estate. Contacts between the two households continued, and the Longyears continued to be generous contributors to the cause of Christian Science. In July 1910, to show their appreciation, the board of directors of the Mother Church made Mary a gift of the spinning wheel that had belonged to Mrs. Eddy's grandmother and had always stood in Mrs. Eddy's childhood home. Mrs. Longyear replied,
I fully appreciate the evidence of trust the directors have in giving me this precious heirloom. I will guard it tenderly. Gratefully yours, Mary B. Longyear.
So began the Longyear Collection. Mary Longyear's diary of 1918 records a moment of decision to collect and preserve historical memorabilia of the Christian Science movement and the life and work of its founder and leader.
The most important thing in the whole world at this time, seems to me, is the preserving of the incidents and authenticity of the history of the life of Mary Baker Eddy. Mary Longyear.
Mary Longyear's deeply held conviction about the need for factual accuracy regarding Mrs. Eddy's history was summed up in a memoir by her son, Robert.
The more complete the factual record could be made, the less opportunity would there be in succeeding centuries to fabricate tissues of imagination in order to vilify or sanctify her. Robert Dudley Longyear.
Mrs. Longyear created an institution charged with carrying out that standard, the Longyear Foundation.
Mrs. Eddy wrote that her earliest writings on Christian Science are valuable to me as waymarks of progress, which I would not have effaced. Places that witnessed Mrs. Eddy's life and work can also serve as waymarks of progress. But first, those places had to be found and saved.
In 1920, guided by her research, Mary Longyear went on a whirlwind tour searching for some of the waymarks of Mrs. Eddy's story. Driving through North Groton, New Hampshire, she discovered the isolated country cottage where the future Mrs. Eddy, then married to Daniel Patterson, lived for 5 years. Mrs. Longyear immediately made plans to purchase it. Then driving on to Rumney, New Hampshire, she found the house where the Pattersons lived prior to their move to Massachusetts. Mary bought the house on the spot, while standing in a nearby potato field with her driver as witness. A scant 3 days later in Swampscott, Massachusetts, she located the house on Paradise Road where in 1866, Mrs. Patterson experienced a remarkable recovery from serious injuries suffered in a fall. 3 days after that, in Amesbury, Mrs. Longyear identified Sarah Bagley's house, still furnished as it was when the discoverer of Christian Science twice found refuge there. It was not for sale at that moment. Mary was not discouraged.
If it is right for me to preserve this house, I will get it someday. If it is not God's will, I do not want it. Mary Longyear.
In another 2 days, she was in Stoughton, south of Boston, scouting out the houses where Mrs. Eddy had begun her teaching.
As a result of Mrs. Longyear's 9-day expedition, her collection would own 4 historic houses in North Groton, Rumney, Swampscott, and Amesbury. Her Longyear Foundation would, in the future, continue to acquire waymarks of Christian Science history. Because of her foresight, in 1961, when the Wentworths' former home was offered as a gift, the Longyear Foundation was here to receive it. Again in 1985, the Foundation was able to receive as a gift the house at 62 North State Street in Concord, New Hampshire, where Mrs. Eddy lived and worked during the pivotal years from 1889 to 1892. Mrs. Longyear initiated a program of historic restoration, which still continues. saving these houses for the future while making sure they authentically represent the past.
The purpose of all this preserving of houses associated with Mrs. Eddy is, as Mary Longyear said,
to make them distributing centers of knowledge regarding her life, illustrating the ethics of truth, not as shrines where her personality would be worshipped.
All this and more is brought to mind by the historical collections and by the carefully preserved historic places where Mrs. Eddy lived during the advancing steps of her life work. To remember those particular days of old is not just to reminisce, but to understand, and to appreciate anew what was required of Mary Baker Eddy to bring Christian Science to humanity. As Mary Longyear said,
"We must know her motives and her simple natural life, know her struggles and her overcoming of them. We must learn to endure and love as she did."